Here we go. Continuing on with reading my book. Just getting a little bit in before work. We're on to Chapter 5, Spiritual Praxis. So page 89 if you're following along in the text. I start with another quote from Pope Francis here. Today, however, we have realized that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice and debates on the environment, so as to hear both the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth. End quote. 3 glimpses. The morning sun glimmers through the red and blue stained glass as a congregation sings for the beauty of the earth. In communion with God and neighbors, I want to be a better steward for God's environment. Outside, under the chilly Beltane sun, a drummer plays and we sing a Druid elder song. We are one family. In this community, dancing with friends and strangers, I become kin to non-human animals and plants. I sit beneath an old maple and meditate on the Zen cone, a drop of water. What right do I have to waste even a single drop? On earth as it is in heaven. During first period prep, when the towers fell that disastrous September morning, New York didn't feel distant. The Pentagon didn't feel distant. Told not to tell students, the principal sent handwritten updates to us throughout the day. Another plane followed, falling outside of Pittsburgh, where I taught elementary general music. Leading the children in song was difficult for me, but they were unaware and sang strongly through second period. By fourth period, the 5th grade class, and half still in class, knew something was wrong. Why had so many of their classmates been picked up early? In loco parentis, the phrase had never meant anything to me before. Now it weighed heavily. Only 26 years old, not a parent. Who was I to be responsible for these children? And how horrible would today become before it ended? What can I do? Would planes continue to fly into buildings? How long should I, keep my students unaware? They saw teachers crying. They heard hushed voices. I didn't lose my faith on 9/11/2001. Hyper-nationalistic, conservative, anti-Muslim rhetoric following shook my faith in America and in the Catholic Church. I read and prayed, unable to make sense of this senseless day. I entered what St. John of the Cross named the dark night of the soul. Not finding answers in an ostensibly right-wing church, finding tradition insufficient and finding my prayers unanswered, I put my ear to the ground. The first prayer I heard was the Our Father, taking those words to heart, on earth as it is in heaven. I began to look below my feet. On the earth I disavowed solace I once took in tradition, dogma, and doctrine. I stopped going to church and started going to the woods. I allowed Mother Earth to become my parent. Studying Buddhism and various earth religions, I found sustenance in being with communities connected to each other and nature. I searched in these other traditions for the truth for years. I met many friends who were also searching, but could not unearth the truth. Without finding, I settled for gaining some wisdom along the way. My path, which is mine and mine alone, a paradox, led me back to the Catholic Church. Jesus, who meditated in the wilderness before beginning his mission, preached the Beatitudes and the prodigal son, and gave us Our Father, called me to return. Revisiting authors I had not in years, I rediscovered profoundly life-giving, ecologically sustainable, and deep-rooted spirituality of my youth, my family, and my church. This rediscovery was new. I had been through my dark night of the soul and discovered a more interconnected and reconnected, relegado to the divine heart, spirituality. So religion is relegado, meaning reconnected. Spiritual aims. Contemplating the ecological crises is disheartening. Centuries of unrelenting environmental degradation continue, and two of our society's trusted remedies, government policy and technological development, seem feeble. Some policies have been successful, especially decades-old policies such as in the U.S., the 1963 Clean Air Act, the 1972 Clean Water Act, the 1980 Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, and the 1973 Endangered Species Act. However, international action on climate change has been less effective. The 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Treaty in Rio de Janeiro famously identified a wish to halt climate change's 2 degrees Celsius increase to avoid dangerous anthropogenic climate change. However, the changes each nation would have to legislate to meet that 2 degrees Celsius goal were identified as voluntary, and those changes have not been implemented. In the current chapter, music education on soil, as rooted and connecting, is understood as a spiritual praxis cultivating the hope we need to face the ecological crises. I work for a university, and universities love technological fixes. These should be explored. Solar, geothermal, biofuel, and wind technologies have made advances. But big oil industries began pulling out of solar, geothermal, and wind investments in 2009, and some companies, like ExxonMobil, have never invested in sustainable energy. This coincides with increases in highly polluting alternative extraction techniques such as fracking, mountaintop removal, and deep water and Arctic drilling. Natural systems scientist Stephen Emmett concludes, quote, "All the science points to the inescapable fact that we are in trouble, serious trouble," end quote. And on today's evidence, technologizing our way out of this does not look likely. With such a negative forecast, can we do anything now, even while policy and technology seem ineffective? Hiding our heads in the sand isn't a viable option. Wendell Berry appropriately notes the ecological challenges are not political but cultural root. Policy, then, without parallel change in cultural beliefs, will be insufficient. In my philosophy of education on soil, outlined in Chapter 1, Philosophy on Soil, the cultural disconnection that led to our ecological crises is understood as a spiritual problem and requires a spiritual reconnection to neighbors, to actual places, and to an expanded view of self that values non-human life forms and their musicking intrinsically. See Chapter 4, Deep Ecology. Using a phenomenological sentence structure, I can write musics for spiritual aims. This sentence will be theoretically expanded throughout this chapter and labeled sentence number, and that was sentence number 1. We begin to heal the earth by recognizing our participation in the ecological crises. Henry Nouwen writes, quote, "In the solitude of the heart, we can feel that the cruel reality of history is a reality of the human heart, our own included, and that to protest asks, first of all, for a confession of our own participation in the human condition," end quote. The underlying solitude of the heart seems to involve a mode of having rather than being. Participating in industrial society, we built, sold, bought, spoiled, and threw away our way into the ecological crises. This is the having mode. We have become disconnected from one another, and we further exacerbate the having mode. Degrading ourselves, we become human havings rather than human beings. It should be no surprise that human havings degrade the environment. People need roots, but our current education system educates people to leave home. One of the costs is psychological, and the other is at once cultural and ecological. When we are disconnected from one another, we are unable to live and act well. Feeling connected to people and places is psychologically beneficial. For instance, people who feel connected to nature experience reduced anxiety. But education has historically been disconnecting. Feminist Bell Hooks suggests conventional education teaches us that disconnection is organic to being. A philosophy of music education on soil rejects disconnecting practices because they are not organic or sustainable. Scholars of many faith traditions have put forth ecological statement. Muslim scholar Saeed Hossein Nasser suggests the problem is modern scientism. Quote, a complete and totalitarian philosophy which reduces all reality to the physical domain and does not wish under any condition to accept the possibility of the existence of non-scientific worldviews. End quote. This critique seems similar to critiques of scientism by Henri Bergson, Herbert Marcuse, and Erich Fromm, but from a religious point of view. Nasir argues the ecological crisis cannot be solved without paying particular attention to the spiritual dimensions of the problem. Living in harmony with nature requires looking at the source of nature. Because deep ecology involves exploring the ecological self, part of the transforming process required to heal ourselves in the world, deep ecologists understand themselves as scientific, psychological, social, and spiritual beings. In previous chapters, Eco-literate music pedagogy was presented as music education on soil, rooted in place and respectful of tradition. Delving into interdisciplinarity and ecomusicology expanded understandings of eco-literate music pedagogy. Music education on soil was deepened to emphasize the intrinsic value of non-human being in musicking. In the current chapter, spirituality is theorized as praxial, guided by intentionality and understood as action rather than only aesthetic. Ideas of Catholic and Buddhist eco-theologians and authors are used to justify a spiritual praxis for eco-literate music pedagogy. Living a good life involves an expanded understanding of self, interconnected to God, other humans, non-humans, and places. Thank you for listening. We're going to stop there and pick back up there on page 92 next time.